Sandals, sermons, miracles. That's how most people picture the world of Jesus, a distant spiritual landscape softened by time and religious memory. But strip away the theology, and what you actually find is something far more familiar: a ruthless economic machine crushing ordinary people under debt, taxes, and systemic inequality. This is the history and money, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. Rome didn't conquer to liberate, it conquered to extract. By the first century, the Roman Empire had perfected something no civilization before it had fully achieved: a continent-scale wealth transfer system. Grain, silver, labor, land. All of it moved in one direction, inward, toward Rome. Provinces weren't partners, they were pipelines. Judea was one of those pipelines. And Judea had almost nothing to give. It was rural, agricultural, fragile. Most families worked plots of land barely large enough to survive on. There were no profit margins here. There was only enough, and sometimes not even that. A drought didn't mean a difficult year, it meant catastrophe. And Rome didn't adjust for catastrophe. The tax system was designed to be inescapable. Today we think of taxation as something linked to income. You earn, you pay. But in Judea, taxes weren't tied to earnings. They were tied to existence. Land tax, produce tax, head tax, road tolls, market fees, and layered on top of all of that, religious taxes owed to the temple in Jerusalem. Collection wasn't handled by government officials. Rome outsourced it to private contractors called tax farmers. These men paid Rome up front for the right to collect taxes in a region. Then they squeezed the population to recover their investment and pocket the difference. Abuse wasn't a side effect of the system. It was the business model. Miss a payment and there was no negotiation, no appeals court, no grace period. There was only debt. Debt was the real engine of dispossession. Here's how the cycle worked, and it repeated itself across Judea constantly. A farmer plants his field, the weather fails, the harvest collapses, but the taxes don't. So he borrows, usually from a wealthier landowner or an elite connected to temple administration. Interest compounds. The next season yields barely enough to survive, let alone repay. Eventually, the creditor takes the land. The farmer doesn't disappear, he stays. Now as a tenant working fields that used to belong to his family. Or he becomes a day laborer, selling his time for wages that barely cover food. This wasn't misfortune, it was architecture. Land accumulated steadily in fewer and fewer hands. Smallholders vanished, large estates expanded. The wealthy grew wealthier not through innovation or productivity, but through systematic absorption of the desperate. And there was no floor, no bankruptcy protection, no debt restructuring, no public safety net of any kind. If your family fell, the only cushion was other families, who were usually falling too. Poverty wasn't a personal failure, it was a structural output. This point matters enormously. And it's where modern audiences most often misread the ancient world. The poor of Judea were not poor because they lacked discipline or virtue. They were poor because the system required a large pool of poor people to function. Rome needed surplus extracted from somewhere. Local elites needed tenant farmers and debtors. The temple needed revenue. Every layer of power drew from the same depleted source, the people at the bottom. The result wasn't just economic hardship. It was social collapse in slow motion. Losing land meant losing status. Losing status meant losing identity. Families that had worked the same soil for generations found themselves erased, not by war, but by compound interest. And in that pressure cooker, ideas became dangerous. Judea was not a quiet province. It was volatile. Rebellions flared regularly. Banditry surged, not because people were criminals, but because desperation had no legal outlet. Messianic movements didn't emerge from comfortable communities. They emerged from collapse. They offered what the system refused to provide: a narrative where the current order wasn't permanent, where reversal was possible, where the last could, in fact, become first. When audiences heard a preacher talk about debt forgiveness, they weren't processing a spiritual metaphor, they were hearing a policy proposal. When they heard about release and jubilee, they were hearing economic survival language. These words meant something specific and urgent to people who owed money they could never repay. The temple was supposed to be the answer. Instead, it was part of the problem. Most people today picture the Jerusalem temple as a house of prayer, and it was. But it was also something else entirely: a major financial institution. The temple functioned simultaneously as a treasury, a bank, a tax authority, and a judicial body. Every adult Jewish male owed a yearly temple tax, paid in a specific silver coin, the Tyrian shekel, because of its reliable silver content. Roman and local coins weren't accepted, which meant money changers were required. And money changers charged fees. Pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem for festivals needed to exchange currency. Vendors sold sacrificial animals at temple-approved prices. The poor paid less, but they still paid. Religion wasn't relief from Roman taxation. It was an additional layer stacked on top. And here was the deeper contradiction. The temple hierarchy was politically intertwined with Roman authority. High priests weren't elected by communities or chosen for spiritual depth. They were appointed with Roman approval. Their job was to maintain order and ensure revenue kept flowing, which meant the institution claiming moral authority over the people was operating the same extraction logic as the empire it supposedly stood apart from. People noticed. By the 1st century, resentment toward temple leadership was widespread. Not rejection of faith, rejection of hypocrisy. The institution meant to mediate between God and humanity looked increasingly like another management layer serving elite interests. This is the world Jesus walked into, and he understood it precisely. He didn't speak in abstractions. He spoke in the language of daily economic life: debt, wages, creditors, landlords, day laborers, stewards, vineyards. These weren't randomly chosen metaphors. They were the vocabulary of survival for everyone listening. When he sat with tax collectors, the most despised figures in the social order, collaborators in the extraction machine, he wasn't making a theological statement about sinners. He was making a social statement about who deserved dignity. When he spoke of forgiveness, the word carried a double meaning his audience understood immediately. Forgiveness of sins, yes, but also forgiveness of debts. The same Greek word covered both. That wasn't coincidence. It was precision. And when he walked into the temple courtyard and overturned the tables of the money changers, that moment was not religious theater. It was economic confrontation. He wasn't protesting prayer. He was attacking the mechanism that monetized access to the sacred, that placed God behind a transaction wall the poor couldn't afford to fully cross. He called it a den of robbers, not because money existed there, but because extraction had replaced justice there. That act crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Rome tolerated poverty. It tolerated inequality. It tolerated preachers. What it could not tolerate was instability, especially during Passover, when Jerusalem swelled with tens of thousands of pilgrims, all of them carrying the same grievances. Temple authorities understood the calculus. An angry crowd plus a compelling narrative plus a festival equals insurrection. From their perspective, the threat wasn't theological. It was logistical. Jesus wasn't just offering forgiveness. He was undermining legitimacy. He was making the system's moral foundation visible and therefore questionable. Once people start asking why suffering exists instead of simply accepting that it does, extraction becomes far harder to enforce. Rome won the military confrontation. It never fully won the meaning war. Within a generation of the crucifixion, Judea exploded. In 66 CE, full rebellion erupted. By 70 CE, Jerusalem was under siege. The temple, the financial, religious, and political center of Jewish life, was destroyed, its treasury looted, its priestly class eliminated, hundreds of thousands killed or displaced. Rome dismantled not just the resistance, but the infrastructure that made resistance possible. And then it streamlined extraction. Taxation intensified. Land consolidation accelerated. The debt cycle continued, now without even the temple's contradictory moral language to soften it. But Rome never recovered control of the story because Jesus hadn't been building an army. He hadn't promised a new tax code or a redistribution program. He had done something more durable. He had offered an alternative moral logic, one where debt didn't reflect divine judgment, where the poor were central rather than peripheral, where legitimacy required more than force. Small communities formed in the decades after his death that operated on different economic assumptions, shared resources, mutual aid, internal debt relief, loyalty based on belief rather than land or bloodline. They weren't trying to overthrow Rome. They were building a parallel moral economy inside it. Rome could crush armed rebellions efficiently. This kind of challenge was harder to locate. It didn't require territory or temples. It moved with people. It survived persecution. It functioned under pressure. By the 4th century, Rome didn't eliminate this alternative framework. It absorbed it. And in doing so, quietly conceded something it had never admitted openly: that authority could no longer rest on force alone. Moral credibility mattered, even to empire. The lesson hasn't expired. Economic systems don't collapse simply because they're unjust. History is full of unjust systems that lasted centuries. They collapse when the stories that justify them stop being believed. Rome optimized extraction with extraordinary efficiency. What it never repaired was the moral breach, the growing inability to convince people that their suffering was necessary, deserved, or divinely ordered. That breach, opened not by armies, but by words spoken to indebted farmers in an occupied province, proved impossible to close. Once people stop accepting that suffering is the price of order, power has a problem that no legion can solve. History doesn't repeat, but it does expose patterns. And once you see how power defends itself, not just with violence but with stories, it becomes very difficult to stop seeing it. Hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.